Ruthless Mafia boss's fiancée slapped the waitress. What he did next shocked the restaurant. The crack echoed through Taverna's soul like a gunshot dressed in diamonds. Maria Santos stumbled backward, bisque running down her uniform, a handprint blooming red across her left cheek. The woman who hit her was already turning back to her wine glass, adjusting her engagement ring like she'd just swatted something insignificant off the tablecloth. 50 diners froze. Forks suspended. Conversations dead. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then a chair scraped back at the head table. The man who stood wasn't looking at the waitress. He was looking at the woman wearing his ring. And the expression on his face made every person in that restaurant forget how to swallow. A waitress just got slapped by the most untouchable woman in Boston, and the most dangerous man in the city is about to choose a side nobody expected. Subscribe and stay, because what happens next changes everything for everyone in this room. 40 minutes earlier, Maria Santos had been standing in the employee bathroom at Taverna Sol, reapplying glue to the sole of her left shoe. The right one she'd fixed yesterday. Both were 6 months past replacement, but replacement required money, and money required math that never balanced, no matter how many times she ran the numbers. 26 years old, 11 hours into a double shift. 5 nights a week at Taverna Sol, one of Boston's most exclusive waterfront restaurants, where a single bottle of wine cost more than her weekly groceries. Weekends, she cleaned offices in a downtown high-rise. Toilets and trash cans and the desks of people who left coffee rings on wood that cost more than her rent. Every dollar she earned had a name before it touched her hand. 3 months of overdue rent, bus fare, groceries, and the bills for her younger sister Paloma, whose autoimmune condition required treatment that insurance had decided wasn't essential enough to cover. Maria didn't complain, didn't call in sick, didn't ask for favors. She showed up. She survived. That was the whole biography. Tonight, the private dining area was reserved for Nico Ferraro. In public, import businesses, real estate holdings, philanthropic boards. In private, the head of Boston's most powerful crime family. A machine built by his grandfather, expanded by his father, and refined by Nico into something so woven into the city's infrastructure that pulling one thread would unravel half the economy. 35, calculated. The kind of quiet that made loud men reconsider every word they'd ever said in his presence. Beside him sat Celeste Ashford, fiancée, Beacon Hill royalty. Old money so old it had forgotten what earning felt like 3 generations ago. Their engagement wasn't romance, it was architecture. Celeste's family connections gave Nico political cover and social access to circles that didn't open for men with his last name. Celeste got the lifestyle and power that inherited wealth could no longer sustain on its own. A merger dressed in a 4-carat diamond. Mireia was assigned to their table. She was careful, professional, invisible in the way she'd been trained to be, present enough to serve, absent enough to never be noticed. Celeste had been drinking since before the appetizers landed. Her mood had a target, and it didn't care who filled the role. When Mireia placed the bisque, Celeste declared it cold without touching it. Mireia apologized immediately and offered a replacement. Celeste escalated, called her careless, commented on her accent, made a remark about how some people should feel grateful they're even permitted to serve people like us. Mireia absorbed every word, kept her hands steady, kept her voice even, offered the replacement again. Then her wrist caught the edge of Celeste's water glass while clearing the bowl. 3 drops hit the tablecloth. Celeste was on her feet before the glass stopped spinning. Her palm connected with Mireia's cheek hard enough to turn her head sideways and send the bisque cascading down the front of her uniform. The restaurant went silent. 50 people. Not one voice. Mireia stood there with soup dripping from her collar and fire spreading across her cheekbone. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who thought you were beneath them only confirmed what they already believed. Celeste smoothed her dress and sat back down, picked up her wine. "Someone get me a new server, preferably one with functioning hands." That's when the chair scraped back. Nico Ferraro stood slowly. The room contracted around him, the way rooms always did when he decided to occupy them fully. He wasn't looking at Maria. He was looking at Celeste. And something had shifted behind his eyes, something tectonic, something that had been locked in a place he didn't visit and had just been dragged into the light by the sound of a woman's hand striking a woman's face. Because Nico Ferraro didn't grow up in Beacon Hill parlors. He grew up in a 2-room apartment above a bakery in East Boston. His mother worked doubles at restaurants exactly like this one. She came home with aching feet and stolen tips and sometimes marks on her arms from customers who believed the help wasn't human enough to bruise. She never complained either. She just showed up. She survived. "Sit down, Celeste." His voice carried no volume. It didn't need any. Celeste laughed, a bright, champagne-soaked sound. "Oh, please. She spilled on me. She's lucky I didn't." I said, "Sit down." The laughter died. Celeste's mouth opened, then closed. Something in Nico's tone had shifted past the point where charm or argument could reach it. He turned to Maria. His eyes moved to the handprint on her cheek, then to the soup staining her uniform, then to her shoes, one sole peeling away from the leather. "Are you all right?" he asked. Maria nodded. Not because she was, because that's what you do when powerful people ask questions in rooms full of other powerful people. You nod and you disappear. But Nico didn't look away. He held her gaze for a moment longer than made sense, long enough for Maria to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Seen. Not evaluated, not dismissed. Seen. He turned to the restaurant manager who had materialized nearby, looking like a man calculating the cost of every possible next sentence. "She's not to be disciplined, not reassigned, not written up. Are we clear?" The manager nodded fast enough to blur. Nico placed his hand on Celeste's back, not gently, not roughly, just firmly enough to communicate that the evening was over. He walked her toward the exit without another word. Celeste's heels clicked fury across the marble, but she went. She always went when Nico moved with that particular stillness. It was the one thing about him that still frightened her. In the car, Celeste erupted. How dare he? In front of people. Over a waitress. Over nobody. She ranted for the entire drive. About embarrassment. About perception. About what the women on the benefit committee would whisper. Nico said nothing. His silence filled the vehicle like smoke filling a sealed room. Celeste mistook it for agreement. For submission. For a man who would forget this by morning. She was wrong about all of it. That night, Nico sat alone in his study. The house was quiet. Celeste had taken a sleeping pill and sealed herself in the master bedroom. The city glittered beyond his window, a machine he'd spent 15 years learning to control. On his desk sat a framed photograph. His mother, 23 years old, wearing a white collared shirt and a black apron. Smiling despite everything the world had already done to her and everything it still had planned. He picked up his phone and dialed. His voice came out low and precise. "The waitress from tonight, Maria Santos. I want to know everything. Her situation, her family, everything. And I want it by morning." He set the phone down and looked at his mother's photograph one more time. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a velvet ring box, and stared at it for a long time. He didn't open it. He just stared at it. Like a man reconsidering every decision that led him to the woman sleeping upstairs, and every instinct pulling him toward the one he'd left standing in a restaurant with soup on her uniform and fire in her eyes. The next morning, Maria walked through the service entrance of Taverna Sole with her resignation letter folded in her apron pocket. She'd written it at 3 a.m. on the back of a utility bill, the only paper in her apartment that wasn't a medical invoice. Better to leave on her own terms than wait for the humiliation of being let go because a rich woman's hand still stung from making contact with her face. The manager intercepted her before she reached the locker room. His expression was strange, not the rehearsed sympathy of a man about to fire someone, but the confused energy of someone holding information he didn't fully understand. "There's an envelope for you." He held it out. "Left anonymously this morning. No name. $5,000. Cash. Crisp hundreds in a plain white envelope." Maria stared at it long enough for the manager to shift uncomfortably and excuse himself. Her first instinct was to leave it on the counter. Money without a name always came with strings tied somewhere you couldn't see until they tightened. But Paloma's next infusion was due in 6 days. The account was empty. The hospital didn't accept pride as a payment method. She took the money and tore up the resignation letter. That evening, Nico Ferraro walked into Taverna Sole alone. No entourage. No private room reservation. He sat at a corner two-top by the window and requested Maria's section. She recognized him before the hostess finished pointing. Her stomach dropped, but her face held steady. She'd learned to keep her reactions somewhere behind her ribs where the world couldn't use them against her. He ordered simply. Ate without performance. Asked for the check, left a tip that doubled the bill, and walked out without looking back. He came back the next night. Same table, same section, same quiet. On the second night, he asked how her shift was going. Not what was on the specials, how her shift was going. Maria gave him the short answer. Fine. He didn't push. On the third night, he remembered she'd mentioned her sister in passing the evening before and asked how Paloma was doing. Maria's guard cracked just enough to let surprise through before she sealed it back up. Men with power didn't remember the names of Waitress's sisters. They barely remembered the waitresses. But Nico listened. Not the way customers listen, half present, already rehearsing their next sentence. He listened the way Maria had stopped believing anyone ever would. Like her words were worth the silence it took to hold them. She didn't trust it, couldn't afford to. She'd learned that attention from powerful men was a currency that always cost more than it gave. But Nico never pushed, never lingered, never asked for anything beyond the menu. Just showed up, ate, listened, and left. Meanwhile, the woman sleeping in Nico's house was building a different kind of plan. Celeste discovered the restaurant visits within days. She had people who watched people, a network of social surveillance she'd maintained since before the engagement because old money trusted nothing, and Celeste trusted less than most. She confronted Nico on the fourth morning over breakfast. Her voice was polished rage. "You're visiting that restaurant. You're sitting in her section." Nico set down his coffee. "I'm reconsidering the engagement." 6 words that dropped the temperature in the kitchen below freezing. Celeste's composure rearranged itself in real time. Shock, then calculation, then something hard and final settling behind her eyes. "That would be an extremely dangerous decision, Nico." She laid it out. 14 months of recordings, private conversations captured on her phone, business discussions, names, routes, details that would interest every federal agency in the state. She'd been collecting insurance since the ring went on her finger, a safety deposit box of leverage designed for exactly this moment. "If you leave me," Celeste said, adjusting her bracelet with fingers that didn't tremble, "I will deliver every recording to the FBI, the Globe, and every political contact who's ever taken your call. Everything your grandfather built, everything your father bled for. Gone." Nico held her gaze. He didn't flinch, but the threat was real, and they both knew it. Across the city, things began appearing in Maria's life without explanation. A new pair of black work shoes left with the hostess. Her size, comfortable, the kind that lasted through 12-hour shifts without destroying your arches. The hostess shrugged when Maria asked who left them. A week later, an anonymous payment wiped Paloma's next 3 months of medical copays. Then a mechanic showed up at her apartment on a Tuesday morning to fix the heating that had been broken since November. Said the bill was covered. Left before she could form a question. Maria didn't connect it immediately. When she did, the timing, the specificity, the fact that nobody in her life knew these details except someone who'd actually been listening. She waited until Taverna Sole closed for the night, walked to Nico's corner table where he sat finishing his espresso, and stood over him with her arms folded. "I don't need saving." "I know." "Then stop. It's not charity, Maria. Then what is it? His eyes moved to the photograph he kept in his wallet. She'd seen him glance at it once, briefly, before paying his check 3 nights ago. He didn't pull it out. He just touched the edge of the leather. My mother worked restaurants like this for 22 years. Broken shoes, stolen tips, rent she couldn't make. She needed exactly these things, and nobody showed up. He met her eyes. I'm not saving you. I'm doing what should have been done for her. Maria stood there. The anger she'd carried to the table didn't dissolve. It just shifted into something she didn't have a name for yet. She sat down across from him. First time. They talked until the cleaning crew started vacuuming around them. About East Boston, about mothers who worked until their hands gave out, about sisters who deserved better than what the system decided they were worth. Maria didn't trust him yet, but she stopped pretending she wanted to. That night, Nico's people delivered the final piece of intelligence he'd been waiting for. What they found didn't just change the engagement, it rewrote everything. Celeste Ashford wasn't just collecting insurance. She was actively feeding intelligence to the Moreno family, a rival organization that had been positioning to move against Nico's territory for 2 years. Wire transfers traced from Celeste's personal accounts to Moreno-linked shell companies. 14 months of payments. Surveillance footage of Celeste meeting Victor Moreno himself on 3 separate occasions. Recorded conversations she'd handed over, not copies of Nico's secrets kept for protection, but originals delivered as operational intelligence. Shipment schedules, personnel names, security protocols. The engagement wasn't a partnership, it was an infiltration. The woman wearing his ring had been dismantling his empire from the inside, while sleeping beside him every night. Nico stared at the photographs spread across his desk. Celeste, shaking hands with the man who wanted him buried. He was still for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Maria. Don't come to work tomorrow night. I need you somewhere. I can't explain everything yet, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Silence on the line. Then her voice, cautious, steady, carrying the weight of a woman deciding whether this was the moment she'd regret or the one she'd been waiting for. Okay. The Copley Grand Ballroom had been transformed into a temple of generosity, or at least the performance of it. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across 400 guests in designer formal wear. A string quartet played something elegant and forgettable. Waiters circulated with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays. The annual Ashford Foundation charity auction, Boston's most prestigious evening, was in full swing. Celeste Ashford stood near the stage in a crimson gown, co-chairing the event the way she co-chaired everything, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass and a handshake that came with invisible invoices. She was radiant, commanding, completely unaware that the evening she'd spent 6 months planning was about to become the last public appearance she'd ever make under her own name. Nico had spent the week building the case. Every wire transfer, every surveillance photograph, every recorded meeting between Celeste and the Moreno organization. Documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced. His tech people had loaded it into the venue's AV system through the head of event security, a man whose daughter needed a kidney transplant 3 years ago. Nico made a phone call. The daughter got her transplant. Debts like that don't expire. 2 hours before the first guest arrived, Nico's people accessed Celeste's devices remotely and wiped every recording she'd made. Every conversation, every file, every piece of leverage she'd spent 14 months assembling. Her nuclear option evaporated while she was getting her hair styled in a suite upstairs. Maria stood in a small apartment in East Boston, staring at the gown hanging on her closet door. Nico had sent it that morning. Not flashy, not excessive. Simple, elegant. The kind of dress that didn't need a designer label to command attention because it trusted the woman wearing it to do that on her own. Nico's Aunt Donna arrived to help her get ready. Warm hands, no judgment. She pinned Maria's hair and told her about Nico's mother, how she used to say that the only difference between a queen and a waitress was that one of them actually knew what hard work tasted like. Maria's hands trembled while she fastened her earrings. She was a waitress from East Boston, about to walk into a room full of people who had only ever seen her holding a tray. People who tipped her without looking at her face. People who thought invisible was a job description. A knock. Nico stood in the doorway. Dark suit, no tie. He looked at her and stopped. Not dramatically, not performed. He just stopped. The way a man stops when something he's been looking at suddenly comes into focus. You look like you're about to walk into a room and make every person in it reconsider what they thought they knew. Maria almost smiled. Almost. I don't even know what I'm walking into. You will. They arrived at the Copley Grand in a black car that drew exactly the kind of attention Nico usually avoided. He stepped out first, offered his hand. Maria took it, and the flash of cameras from the society photographers stationed at the entrance hit her like a wall of white light. Inside the ballroom, the effect was immediate. Heads turned. Whispers spread faster than the champagne. Nico Ferraro, without Celeste Ashford on his arm. Instead, a woman nobody recognized. A woman wearing elegance like she'd been born in it, but carrying herself with the unmistakable posture of someone who'd earned every step she'd ever taken. Celeste spotted them from across the room. Her champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. The color left her face in stages, confusion first, then recognition, then something darker than both. The waitress, the nobody from Taverna Soul. Standing in the space Celeste had occupied at every event for the last 2 years, wearing a gown that fit like it was made for her, on the arm of the man whose ring Celeste was still wearing. It took Celeste less than 90 seconds to cross the ballroom. Her heels hit marble like controlled detonations. The smile she assembled for the audience was brittle enough to shatter if you breathed on it wrong. Nico, her voice pitched warm for the crowd. I see you brought entertainment. Maria didn't flinch. She'd been spoken to like this her entire life by women who confused cruelty with status. She held Celeste's gaze the way a woman holds it when she's survived worse than words from someone who's never had to survive anything. Careful, Celeste, Nico said quietly. You're in public. And you're making a fool of yourself. Celeste's mask slipped just enough to show the venom underneath. She turned to the gathering crowd of onlookers, raised her voice. Since my fiancé seems to have lost his judgment along with his taste, maybe it's time everyone here knows exactly who Nico Ferraro really is. She pulled out her phone, held it up like a weapon. The room contracted. 400 people watching a woman about to detonate her own engagement on a stage she'd built herself. I have recordings, Celeste announced. Private conversations, business dealings. The real Nico Ferraro. Not the philanthropist, not the businessman, the criminal. She tapped the screen. Nothing. She tapped again, scrolled, searched. Her fingers moved faster, frantic now. The files were gone. Every recording, every document. 14 months of leverage, erased. The room shifted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Celeste's performance was unraveling in real time. A woman holding an empty gun in front of 400 witnesses. Technical difficulties? Nico's voice carried just enough for the nearest 100 people to hear. Not mocking. Worse. Calm. Celeste's composure fractured. You did this. You. Then the ballroom screens flickered to life. Not with Nico's secrets. With Celeste's. Wire transfers to Moreno-linked shell companies filled every screen. Surveillance photographs. Celeste, sitting across from Victor Moreno in a private restaurant, shaking his hand, passing sealed envelopes. Bank records spanning 14 months. Her own voice playing through the ballroom speakers. Clear, unmistakable. Detailing Nico's operations to the man who wanted him dead. The silence that followed was the kind that ends careers, ends legacies, ends the version of yourself you spent your whole life constructing. Celeste stood in the center of her own charity event, watching everything she'd built, everything she'd married into, manipulated for, betrayed for, disintegrate on screens she'd paid to install. 400 people she'd spent years cultivating stared at her like she was something they'd just found on the bottom of their shoes. Maria watched from beside Nico. She didn't speak, didn't gloat. She simply stood there, visible, present, real, in a room that had never seen her before tonight and would never forget her after it. Celeste turned to Nico one final time, her voice low enough that only he and Maria could hear. "This isn't over." Nico's expression didn't change. "Yes, it is." He raised one hand. The ballroom screens went dark, but the damage was permanent. Phones had captured everything. The footage was already spreading. Texts, streams, posts multiplying faster than Celeste's lawyers could ever contain. And in the silence that followed, in the wreckage of a ballroom that had been built to celebrate Celeste Ashford's generosity, Maria felt Nico's hand find hers. Not a performance, not for the cameras. His fingers laced through hers and held on like a man who'd finally found something worth holding that wouldn't betray him the moment he looked away. She didn't pull away. The fallout moved faster than Celeste's heels could carry her toward the exit. 400 guests who had been clinking glasses in her honor 60 seconds ago now parted around her like she was contaminated. Donors who'd written six-figure checks to her foundation before the appetizers were already on their phones with accountants. Board members she'd hand-selected over 5 years of calculated lunches turned their backs in real time. The senator's wife, who'd co-chaired last year's auction with Celeste, looked through her like she'd never existed. Security arrived. Not Nico's people, the hotel's own staff. They escorted Celeste through the service entrance because even the venue wanted distance from what had just been projected on their screens. In the lobby, 2 federal agents waited with questions about wire fraud, conspiracy, and enough evidence to keep a grand jury busy for months. The Ashford family attorney was already on the phone, but his voice had the hollow quality of a man who knew the math didn't work. Victor Moreno's name was now permanently linked to Celeste's across every screen in that ballroom. His inside weapon exposed, his political cover shredded. The alliance he'd spent 2 years building against Nico collapsed before it ever struck. Not from violence, not from war, but from a woman's betrayal played back to her in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. Celeste passed within arm's reach of Maria on her way out. She stopped, looked at her, not with the imperial disgust from the restaurant, with something rawer, the furious disbelief of a woman who had slapped someone she considered invisible and was now watching that same someone standing untouched in the wreckage of her entire life. Maria held her gaze, didn't flinch, didn't gloat, just stood there breathing, which was enough. Her existence in that room was the loudest statement anyone had made all evening. Celeste looked away first, disappeared through the service door. The last glimpse anyone caught was crimson fabric vanishing around a corner, the color of a woman who'd burned everything she touched and finally got caught standing in the fire. The weeks that followed were thorough. Courts froze Celeste's accounts. The foundation she'd co-chaired launched an internal audit that uncovered 3 years of misallocated funds. The Ashford family, 3 generations of carefully maintained Beacon Hill respectability, went quiet in the way old money goes quiet when the name becomes something people whisper instead of admire. Celeste herself faced 14 counts across 2 jurisdictions. Her legal team cycled through 3 firms before one finally stuck, and even they looked uncomfortable sitting beside her. Nico handled the Moreno situation without fanfare. With their inside source exposed and their political protection evaporated, the Morenos had no leverage and no allies. Victor Moreno requested a sit-down. Nico declined. He didn't need to negotiate with a man whose entire play had depended on a woman who was currently being fitted for an ankle monitor. Months passed. Boston moved on the way cities always do, absorbing scandal, digesting it, filing it under cautionary tales told at dinner parties. Maria stopped working at Taverna Sol, not because someone rescued her, because for the first time in her adult life, she had enough room to breathe, enough space between emergencies to remember that before she became a woman who survived, she'd been a woman who dreamed. The business degree she'd been chipping away at between double shifts and weekend cleaning jobs, 3 credits here, 2 credits there, progress measured in semesters that stretched across years. She finished it, quietly, without announcement. She used the knowledge the way she used everything, practically. She found a lease on a small storefront in East Boston, 3 blocks from the bakery where Nico's mother used to buy bread after her shifts. The space needed work. The floors were uneven. The kitchen was outdated. The neighborhood had been overlooked by every developer who'd ever drawn a map of Boston's future. She named it Soul, a quiet nod to the restaurant where everything changed, and the Italian word for sun. Paloma worked the register on weekends. Her treatment was fully funded now. She was healthy enough to complain about the early hours and argue with Maria about the playlist and eat leftover pastries when she thought no one was watching. Maria considered these the most beautiful sounds in the world. Opening day. The cafe was small but full. Neighborhood regulars, a few curious strangers. The smell of fresh espresso and bread baked from a recipe Maria had learned from her grandmother, a woman who'd fed an entire building in Santo Domingo from a kitchen the size of a closet and never once called it charity. The door opened and Nico walked in. He looked different. Not in the face, in the shoulders. The permanent tension that had lived there for as long as anyone had known him. The coiled readiness of a man who'd spent his adult life calculating threats from every direction was quieter. Still present, but no longer the first thing you noticed about him. He'd restructured, stepped back from the parts of the operation that required the version of himself he was tired of being. Delegated. Trusted. Selectively, carefully, but trusted. Still powerful. Still respected. But choosing differently now. Choosing what to build instead of what to control. He sat at the counter. Maria poured his coffee without asking how he took it. She already knew. Black, no sugar. Same as every night at Taverna Sol. He took a sip and set the mug down, looked around the cafe, the mismatched chairs, the hand-painted menu board, the photographs on the wall of East Boston through the decades, and he looked at her. First time I've ever sat in a restaurant and felt like I was exactly where I'm supposed to be. Maria leaned against the counter. The morning light caught her face. No makeup, flour on her apron, hair pulled back. She looked nothing like the woman in the gown at the Copley Grand. She looked better. She looked like herself. "You know when I knew?" she said. "Knew what?" "That you were different from every man who's ever sat across from me." Nico waited. It wasn't the gala. It wasn't what you did to Celeste. It wasn't the money or the power or any of it. She looked at his hands wrapped around the mug. It was the shoes. He blinked. The shoes. The work shoes you left with the hostess. You never said a word, never put your name on it. You just noticed mine were falling apart and you fixed it. Her eyes met his. That told me who you were before your last name ever could. Because my mother used to say, you don't watch what a man does when people are looking. You watch what he does when he thinks no one will ever know. Nico reached across the counter and took her hand. She didn't pull back, didn't hesitate. She held on the way a woman holds on when she's finally found something that doesn't require her to be less than what she is. He kissed her. Not in a ballroom, not in a penthouse. In a small cafe in East Boston that smelled like espresso and fresh paint and bread baked from a recipe that had crossed an ocean in a grandmother's memory. Two people who met across a divide that should have kept them invisible to each other forever, and chose to stay. When they pulled apart, Maria looked out the window at the neighborhood waking up around them. Mrs. Delgado from the 3rd floor walking her dog, the Torres kids chasing each other to the bus stop. A city block that had been forgotten by everyone with the power to remember it, now anchored by a cafe built by a woman who knew what it meant to be overlooked, and decided that nobody who walked through her door would ever feel that way. Across the city in a rented studio in Quincy, Celeste Ashford sat on a second-hand couch watching the evening news. The anchor smiled into the camera. And finally tonight, a story about community. Soul Cafe opened its doors today in East Boston, bringing life back to a neighborhood that's been waiting for exactly this kind of investment. Owner Maria Santos says the mission is simple. Good food, open doors, in a place where everyone belongs. The camera panned to Maria behind the counter, flour on her apron, Nico beside her, both smiling. The kind of smiling that doesn't perform for cameras, the kind that happens when two people are standing exactly where they chose to be. Celeste reached for the remote, turned off the television, and sat in the silence of a studio apartment that smelled like nothing and no one. Living with the knowledge that the woman she'd slapped in a restaurant was now the woman who had everything Celeste had spent her whole life pretending to deserve. She slapped a waitress in a crowded restaurant. She thought her ring made her untouchable. She thought the woman she struck was nobody. She was wrong about all of it. If you made it this far, you felt something, and we both know it. Hit that subscribe button and be part of what we're building here. A space where stories don't just entertain. They remind you that the people the world overlooks are usually the ones worth watching closest. Drop a comment. Tell us what you'd name your cafe. Share this with someone who's been made to feel invisible. We read every single one. See you in the next story.